Who are we? The psychologist Dan McAdams offers a theory of personality that splits us into three groups. Firstly, we're social actors. We tend to enact behaviors and perform roles in the presence of others. Secondly, we're motivated agents. We have inner desires and expectations that inform our social behavior. And finally, we're autobiographical authors. We have the fun habit of constructing and revising a narrative of our life at every turn, integrating our goals and values into some sort of coherent identity. Of course, actually understanding why people do what they do through their behaviors, quirks, and decisions is difficult business. The serial killer Ted Bundy, who had some education in psychology, likened such a task to going to the mouth of a river, pulling out a handful of water and asking, "Where did this come from?" The case of the 45th President of the United States is certainly a case of such psychological complexity. As Mary Trump, an American psychologist and also Trump's niece, explained, the fact is Donald's pathologies are so complex and his behaviors so often inexplicable that coming up with an accurate and comprehensive diagnosis would require a full battery of psychological and neuropsychological tests that he'll never sit for. However, one component of Trump's psychology does offer us ample space to understand who he is: his fundamental goal towards promoting the greatness of the self. After all, we would likely have never heard of the guy if he wasn't so tenacious in advertising his strength, his power, his financial success, and so on. It is from this angle, an assumption of his narcissism, where we can begin to understand who he is and why he does what he does. Despite its common use in everyday conversation, the actual disorder of narcissism, as a narcissistic personality disorder, impacts only 1% of the population. Narcissism, when it does not cause distress or impaired functioning, is generally not considered to be a personality disorder. Within narcissism, there are two main variants: grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. Grandiose narcissists tend to project a sense of self-importance, entitlement, aggression, and dominance. Although some research has suggested that grandiose narcissists demonstrate a fragile and vulnerable self-esteem, they tend to do a very good job of not showing it, or perhaps do not actually have it. It should be noted that grandiosity may actually improve psychological health and motivate better performance in some instances. Whereas the grandiose tend to truly believe that they are the best and greatest, vulnerable narcissists believe that they should or could be the best. Hence, they tend to demonstrate a more defensive and fragile grandiosity, a hypersensitivity, and experience chronic feelings of emptiness and issues with abandonment. Vulnerable narcissists have also been shown to demonstrate a greater amount of shame on a daily basis. Campbell and Foster developed the basic ingredients of narcissism. These include such items as the fact that narcissists think that they are better than others, that their views tend to be contrary to reality, that they are selfish, and that they are oriented towards success above all else. Of course, narcissism can be adaptive in some instances. Many leaders and high-performing individuals have exceeded in their fields, to the benefit of many, through their drive to promote their greatness above all else. This can be partially explained through the fact that we are primed to be attracted to narcissists. Several studies have found that narcissists are more physically attractive than average. They are more likely to be outgoing and hence will be more equipped to place themselves in situations where they can promote themselves. They also tend to project a sense of high self-esteem, something that many tend to gravitate towards naturally. In fact, in one study, people still preferred narcissists over non-narcissists, even when they had correctly perceived who was a narcissist. Nonetheless, the initial impression of a narcissist can be quickly obscured when such individuals run out of their narcissistic supply, the admiration and interpersonal support drawn by an individual from their environment that is needed for their self-esteem. This can lead to narcissistic rage, which can range from aloofness to acts of violence and abuse. Especially in the form of malignant narcissism, in which the individual requires ever-increasing levels of psychological gratification, rage can come with features of paranoia, aggression, and sadism. However, at this point, those who have become codependent and enabled the narcissist will likely have sacrificed so much for them that fighting back or simply leaving could lead to a targeted attack by the narcissist, or at the very least, traumatic insight into their own cognitive dissonance. It has been suggested that narcissism develops from a disruption in the mirroring stage of development. Parents may fail to lovingly reflect back their child's need for affirmation. Hence, some use the term narcissistic adaptation rather than narcissism because they see these behavioral patterns as creative adjustments intended to maximize the love and attention they receive in a childhood devoid of stable support. Narcissism comes about in reaction to the unreality of a schizophrenic parent. The child attempts to insulate himself from the parent's confused and conflicting messages, draws in, and walls himself off in the world of his own. Mary Trump's retelling of the family dynamics that she believes led to Donald's behavior closely reflects this theory. Trump's mother, who acted unstable, needy, and was prone to self-pity, would regularly use her kids for comfort rather than comfort them. Her health issues also left her absent from Donald's life for great stretches of his childhood. Fred Trump, the father, seemed to have no emotional needs at all. In fact, he was a high-functioning sociopath. Fred acting as the default caregiver to Donald due to the mother's absence was likely disruptive in emotional development. His parenting style involved outbursts of anger at any moment in which he sensed any neediness from his children. Fred would also instill his life philosophy onto the children, that in life there can only be one winner and that everyone else is a loser. This unstable and hostile environment of feedback from his only caregivers disrupted Donald's need for love and security. He likely developed certain defense mechanisms, such as increasing hostility and aloofness at his parents' treatment, in order to mitigate the fact that his caregivers were physically and emotionally neglectful and hostile. This can be summed up as learned helplessness, in which one accepts that they simply cannot control a situation. Donald accepted the fact that he could not have his emotional needs met, and so acted as if he didn't have any. This, of course, got the attention of his father, who valued emotionless and ruthless decision-making. Fred Trump came to validate, encourage, and champion the things about Donald that rendered him essentially unlovable and were in part the direct result of Fred's abuse. He short-circuited Donald's ability to develop and experience the entire spectrum of human emotion. His capacity to be his own person, rather than an extension of his father's ambitions, became severely limited. Donald would be rarely held to account or challenged by Fred, the only authority figure that he cared about. He would steal toys, refuse to help around the house, and would never admit that he was wrong. By the age of 12, Donald's right side of his mouth was constantly curled up in a sneer, something that his brother would dub the Great I Am. Trump would go on to cheat his way into the University of Pennsylvania and use his dad's money to create his image as a burgeoning master of the universe in elite Manhattan circles. Fred would come to view his son's ability to shamelessly self-promote as a good investment towards advertising the Trump brand name, satisfying his own ambitions that he could never realize. The New York Times has extensively reported just how much this investment cost him. No matter how many bankruptcies, failed investments, and legal trouble he would get into, Donald was always bailed out by his father. This taught him that even in absolute failure, he never truly had to change because he would always come back unscathed. This apparent immunity worked for his image, boosting Trump to the status of a savvy and tenacious businessman, and obscuring the circular fact that Donald was considered a success because he was a success. That was a premise that ignored one fundamental reality. He had not achieved and could not achieve what he was being credited with. Despite that, his ego, now unleashed, had to be fed continually, not just by his family, but by all who encountered it. We see this in the slogan of MAGA, where the again signifies a comeback story to an unknown time where America was once great. The distracting magnificence of the comeback story obfuscates its very core, that perhaps what one is coming back to isn't so great at all. Mary Trump concludes that his defense mechanisms in childhood are just as prevalent today. This is evident in the use of superlatives, his antisocial behavior, his inability to find fault in any of his actions, and the high opinion he has of himself. Donald today is as much as he was at 3 years old, incapable of growing or evolving, unable to regulate his emotions, moderate his responses, or take in and synthesize information. She claims that he knows that he has never been loved, that deep down he is illegitimate, but that his fragile ego simply cannot handle this possibility. This is similar to the writer Sam Vaknin's own theory of the narcissist, that they have lost a true self, the core of their personality. Instead, they exist as reflections of what will give them admiration. There isn't a real person in there, just a deep emptiness guarded by delusions of grandeur and the ever-present threat of rage. Some may argue that Trump is merely acting, that he is playing a narcissistic businessman. This doesn't necessarily refute the idea that he is a narcissist. As McAdams writes, he moves through life like a man who knows he is always being observed, and if he only ever behaves like he is being watched, then it matters little if his internal motives are in any way different. The persona surrounding this emptiness within may fare well on television, but it can grow increasingly dangerous when given the chance to make policy decisions that impact the lives of others. According to Barbara Rez, the former vice president of the construction of a Trump Tower, the emotional core of Trump's personality is anger. This is of course evident in his preoccupation with social dominance, as well as his use of humor that is regularly at the expense of others. Many of his actions as president appear to be informed through personal gripes and anger. His angered assertions that he has been treated worse than any other president perfectly reflects the story of Narcissus himself, who asks the trees if anybody has suffered more than he has in an attempt to give his own suffering superiority. Unfortunately, anger in leaders is something that satisfies the impulses of those who psychologists identify as having authoritarian personalities. Those who hold an authoritarian personality tend to adhere to tradition and moral norms, as well as submit to authorities who personify these norms. They also tend to exhibit antipathy towards outer groups. In the modern era, such a personality tends to show up in those who hold prejudice towards gays, immigrants, and racial minorities, express suspicion towards the humanities and arts, and will exhibit cognitive rigidity and militaristic sentiment. Such personalities tend to support strong leaders due to their fear of insecurity above all else. Hence, individuals like Trump, who demonstrate a shameless confidence in their behavior, bring forth a sense of security and stability for those who fear the approach of outer groups. This is further expressed in Trump's seemingly chronic sense of disgust. As McAdams writes, on a daily basis Trump seems to experience more disgust, or at least to say he does, than most people do. Trump consistently appeals to an ancient fear of contagion, whether it be his disgust of germs or women's bodily fluids. This would also explain why extremely religious Americans would support someone with such a hedonistic and foul-mouthed past. His promise of purity and security from the other overrides the more surface-level preoccupations with promiscuity and cursing. The relationship that Trump has over his supporters parallels the concept of codependency that emerges in literature on narcissism. Codependency is a tendency to act in a passive, controlled manner and engage in relationships of excessive caregiving. Narcissists are considered to be magnets of the codependent, projecting stability, confidence, and a sense of belonging on the condition that the codependents maintain their narcissistic supply. One of the most effective ways for the codependents to satisfy this condition is through engaging in the reality of the narcissist. Usually beliefs are only considered to be true when they are supported by facts. The narcissist instead insists that something is a fact when it corresponds to their belief. This places the narcissist in an unbelievably powerful role as the arbiter of truth. As Eliot Cohen writes, the disorder therefore lies in an epistemological deformity, a breakdown of the ordinary constructs of truth and falsity that make satisfactory interpersonal relationships possible. If the fundamental goal of the narcissist is to have their greatness known, certain aspects of reality must be discounted. They cannot agree that nobody is perfect, that everybody has flaws, and that they can be wrong. Breakups are the fault of the ex. Critics are jealous losers. Lost elections are rigged elections. This breaks down to an essential fear of reality itself. Fear plays a central role. Fear of reality, fear of truth about oneself and one's fallibility, fear of the separateness of others. Fears perpetuate the condition. They stand in the way of its acceptance and treatment. The narcissist is fundamentally a victim of his own fears, which seem so terrible and overwhelming they cannot even be thought of. He is lost in an unrecognized labyrinth of his own unacknowledged fashioning. The narcissist may become so successful in pretense and deception that they lose the ability to detect their own lies. This can lead to an impairment in what is called metacommunication, the capacity to comprehend the intentions behind the language of others. This is also a reason why treating narcissism is so difficult, as the therapist will struggle in developing any coherent dialogue with their client. Unlike most narcissists, Trump was actually handed the tools of the state being that which the sociologist Max Weber declared as holding a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. He used this power to craft his own reality. He has used the effective political mechanisms that are generally utilized to promote certain ideologies, whether it be through the media, campaign rallies, or official government statements, to instead advertise a world in which he alone is the winner. His self-serving assertions regarding election fraud have been celebrated by his supporters, and through the petty actions of withholding care and inciting violence, he has further distanced himself from the fact that his quest for universal admiration is futile. Donald Trump's fantastical conception of himself as the arbiter of reality has spread just as quickly as the pandemic he is so incompetently mismanaged. The linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky recently labeled Donald Trump as the worst criminal in human history. Although he strongly asserted that Mao, Stalin, and Hitler were all monsters, he argues that none had tried to destroy all organized human life. Trump's environmental policies, petty destructiveness, and reported interest in the use of nuclear arms are enough for Chomsky to justify his label. The murderers of the 20th century, although sharing the narcissistic and disagreeable profile of Trump, nonetheless promoted the idea that they were being guided by historical necessity, by something larger than themselves. This was likely useful in motivating others to do their dirty work, convincing those like Adolf Eichmann, for example, to act in such a way that the Führer, if he knew your actions, would approve it. With the compelling force of history on the side of the state, who were they to judge? Trump differs from these dictators largely due to his unsubmitted will. He has no guiding force, no grand strategy, no fundamental drive other than the futile promotion of his own greatness. This has been his greatest strength and weakness. For one, Trump successfully politicized narcissism. He created, promoted, and consolidated an ideology in which he is the sole arbiter of truth and the only winner. The fact that the party-over-country conservatism of the US proved a useful and willing vehicle to Trumpism is far from a shock. Trumpism is an ideology that exists solely to sustain his own fantasy through the unquestioned loyalty of his codependent supporters. Unlike the perverted utopias offered by the Nazis and communists, Trumpism offers nothing more than a future where Trump is the best and the greatest. Trumpism exists to serve only one person. He may in fact be the best ever at being a narcissist. But even narcissism at its most successful has its limits. The myth of Narcissus is that of a young man who, unable to attain his own reflection, drowns to death. This is a tale brought up time and time again in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the classic in which the obsessive Captain Ahab seeks revenge on a whale who had bitten off his leg. Ahab appears aware of both his inability to grasp the world around him as well as the void within himself, the desire for power and purpose. This frustrated drive to fill this hole, to bridge his real self with his desired self, ideal self, consumes him to the point of self-destruction. The focus of Narcissus and Ahab's energies on just one idea actually manifests the intensity of this universal desire to have power and purpose. For their megalomania is only one step removed from anyone who wants something so dearly that they simply won't let go. This impulse to fill the void, at an individual, political, and spiritual level, is universal. Ishmael's musings, that we all see this ungraspable phantom of life in all rivers and oceans, captures this. Water to Melville is a reflection of the mind and imagination. Narcissus, reaching for the image in the water, expresses the desire to attain his very fantasy. He symbolizes the very human desire to be able to find legitimacy in our perception, to grasp something solid and true, rather than be turned round and round in this world fruitlessly by those far mysteries we dream of or in tormented chase of that demon phantom that sometime or other swims before all human hearts. And so Narcissus and Ahab drown to death in the sacrifice of their real selves to this fantasy of the ideal self. Narcissism is rooted in this drive to capture the elusive reflection in the water, and Trump has certainly come close to successfully containing his own fantasy of greatness. Many find humor in the fact that Donald has to use two hands when holding water, and perhaps this is a fitting image, that even he struggles to support the total burden that has become of his perverted fantasy.